In the studio with us is James Fallows from The Atlantic magazine. James, I know you've been sitting here for the past 2.5 hours. I think you seem surprised, should I say, impressed by the lack of politics, the lack of religion that has been, the fact that this ceremony has been so very much centred on remembering.
Yes, and we've discussed over these past 2.5 hours, there are lots of issues of the legacy of the last 10 years and the next 10 years or 50 years of the consequences. But I think the ceremony in New York in particular, and also the glimpses we saw in Pennsylvania, was concentrating on the human aspect here and the universality of the human aspect, strands from all around the world as we heard these names. It's also interesting to me in the Americanness of it, as the longer we've gotten through the reading, the more liberty each one of the family members is taking to give it a little oration. In the beginning it was just saying, and my brother, Mr. X, and so I think that also, I bet by the end of the day they're going to be
very long.
be very long, but which is heartfelt and human in its own way too. So I think this has been, to me, a surprisingly impressive and dignified ceremony.
In fact, just that last reader there was lovely in the way they talked about how we are looked after, we are strong,
yes.
And that really does throw it into the future. And if we look at the future, what do you think will happen next year?
I think this probably is one of a kind. The memorial is being dedicated for the first time, and you can't really recreate this kind of drama year after year after year. So I think we have seen in this in the studio here over the last couple of hours, and all the viewers, something that is, in a sense, the closing of this era. I'm sure that the families will come back next year and 10 years from now too, but as a matter of commemoration, this probably is a peak, and appropriately so.
If it's a closing of this era, then how do you see the conversation about national security and I guess the fight against terrorism, how do you see that playing out in coming years? Do you think something will change?
I think that there is the opportunity, at least on the U.S. side, for some kind of change in policy with the killing of Osama bin Laden. As we've been discussing, there's never going to be a kind of a clear closure in Afghanistan. The situation there is so muddled and so difficult. There's never going to be clear victory or clear defeat. But with the elimination of the person who was the guiding spirit of this 10 years ago, there's the possibility to say, okay, we've done what kind of closure we can. Let's see what now is the sensible way to defend our interest, financial, strategic, and all others in the years ahead.
Because it is extraordinary, isn't it, when you think about how we're 10 years on, but now the talk is a negotiated political settlement that will involve the Taliban.
Sure, because the original objective of going into Afghanistan 10 years ago was to punish and kill Al-Qaida itself, and to try to capture Osama bin Laden. Of course, he got away in the Battle of Tora Bora, and now it's an entirely different agenda that's in prospect. And so I think it makes sense for the leaders of the U.S. and other countries with a stake there, notably including Australia, to say, what is the best decision we can make now to cut our future losses and maximize our future security, and a political solution probably involving the Taliban looks like the best of the options now available.
More broadly, do you think that most Americans want to move on? Do you think most Americans believe this has been too all-encompassing, too all-embracing, if you like?
Well, I think that the ceremony, again, a good part of the ceremony we saw from New York is it allows moving on in the proper way. And again, as you just said, the last young woman saying that the family is well looked after and they miss their father, but they're doing fine, that may be the spirit in which to move ahead, that there is a loss that will never be recovered. Families have been damaged in ways they will never recover from. But nations have to move on, families have to move on, and so the way for all of us to turn our face towards the future is with this appropriate recognition of terrible loss and tragedy, but then striding ahead to make the best of our personal and national lives.
Does there also have to be a recognition that terrorism will always be there as a threat?
I think that mature societies recognize there are certain factors of life that are evil and never will be eradicated. Crime will always be with us. Various sorts of tragedy and evil will be there. And terrorism is going to be a factor of any developed society's life for the long run. So finding a way to protect ourselves as best we can and to buffer ourselves and to be watchful in all proper ways while still maintaining the dignity, the pride, the confidence which makes free societies worth living in, that is the balancing act for the U.S. and other countries to carry out.
I did want to ask you about the whole Arab Spring, if you like, and I guess how that plays back into the feelings of insecurity in America, particularly when you look at the importance of countries, the geopolitical importance of countries like Egypt.
I think think that properly understood, the Arab Spring should be a source of relief and hope in the Western world and the U.S. as opposed to an occasion for fear, even though instability with traditional regimes we have relied on, notably Mubarak in Egypt, that causes some recalculation. But if part of the argument 10 years ago was that the political condition of the Middle East and the Arab part of the Middle East was a problem for its own people, which led to extrapolated problems for the rest of the world, then the fact that the Arab world is joining the democratic renaissance that we've seen in East Asia over the last 20 years, in Latin America, and parts of Africa, that should be a good thing. And even though it is disorderly in many ways, I think it's a progression that the West should welcome and try to support.
Is that also, though, a leap? Do we know that is what they're joining? Do we really know what is going to be the ultimate outcome?
We don't, but if we are true to our beliefs that are the founding principles of our societies, we have to think it's better for these countries to go through the turmoil, at least the medium-term turmoil of a democratic process, than to live together forever with tyranny. Now, we have examples in Iran over the last 20 or 25 years which are cautionary on this front. But in the long run, our societies are based on the proposition that people should freely determine their fates. So if Arab societies are getting in on that bargain now too, we should welcome and try to support it.
We've mentioned a couple of times tonight that, of course, there's been this credible but unconfirmed threat of a terror attack, and that's obviously informed security arrangements, made them even tighter than they were. Did you take that seriously? For many, it was not surprising. Everyone really did expect it. How seriously?
Well, I think, I don't have any inside knowledge about this. It has seemed to be the case that Al-Qaeda and its copycat organizations have placed a lot of emphasis on dates and anniversaries and symbolic occasions, so you would think this is something they would try to disrupt one way or another. So it was not a surprise there'd be these warnings for New York and Washington, D.C. And I'm not obviously in my home of Washington right now, but I would imagine it's even more tightly buttoned down than normal this week.
Do you think that Al-Qaeda is a very different organisation to the one it was 10 years ago?
Certainly, that is what all the reports seem to suggest, and that while, of course, the metastasizing process of Al-Qaeda needs to be taken seriously in the way that people can emulate its tactics even if its core organization is not there, the fact that Osama bin Laden has been killed and many of his lieutenants are either captured or on the run, that seems to have taken some of the steam out of its power.
Well, James Fallows, you've been wonderful to sit with us and provide some context for this morning's events as we go on American time, and we thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you.